want to go right to our good friend Gad Saad. Of course, you have to listen to his podcast, The Sad Truth. And then also his book, The Sad Truth About Happiness, 8 Secrets for Leading the Good Life. His follow-up to the wonderful book, The Parasitic Mind, which you also have to buy as well. Unfortunately, I think about cat urine way too often, and that reference only makes sense if you read his previous book. Mr. Saad, how you doing, sir?
I'm doing well. Apologies if I cough in your viewers' ears. It's because I've been suffering from a really nasty cold. It's great to be with you. Thank you for having me.
We're all powering through it, yes, sir. We're going to start from the beginning. I think we need to define our terms. How do you define happiness?
Right. Great first question. Let's use a framework of dopamine versus serotonin, right? Dopamine is the short-term pleasure calculus, if you'd like, right? I just had a great juicy burger. I just had a fun conversation with someone, so I get that dopamine hit, and so therefore, quote, I'm happy. That's not how I'm using the term in the context of my book. I'm talking about, if you like, serotonin, which is contentment. If you're sitting on the proverbial porch when you're 85 with your spouse and you look back at your life and say, my God, I've had a great marriage, I've had a great profession, raised great kids, had a meaningful group of friends that have always been there for me. I've had a job that's given me purpose and meaning. So it's in that sense that I'm defining happiness. It's an existential glee, if you'd like.
Okay, that's very good. You write in your book you quoted someone who said that it's self-evident. And I've never loved the term, this idea of something that's self-evident. I almost think it's like a cop-out. But I don't know, talk me off that ledge. Like, what are we to do with that? And I'll say this, because you listed some things that are great, I think, are great. The sitting on your porch with your wife when you're 85, looking back at a life well lived. But someone's going to say, oh, well, who are you to say that is good?
Right. Forgive me. Sorry for the cough. Well, that really, so there are, your point is well taken in that there are, of course, individual differences in what is the most direct path for happiness. And so my path may be somewhat different from your path in terms of climbing, to summiting to Mount Happiness. There are also cross-cultural differences in how we define happiness. But underneath these differences, whether they be individual or cultural differences, there is a bedrock of foundational metrics that define how one is happy, right? So, very few people are going to be happy if they're in a miserable relationship and a miserable marriage. Very few people are going to be happy if their jobs, which they go to 8-10 hours every day, is the bane of their existence. It's nothing but drudgery. So yes, there are some elements that we can debate whether those elements constitute a pathway to happiness, but there are some other ones that are incontrovertible. And there is certainly a lot of research that shows that if you ask people their number one goal in life, they usually answer to be happy.
We talked on my radio show about the Greek word eudaimonia, which is like
Yes.
this idea of like a full life. But in your book, you talk about this other Greek word I've never heard before. Is it ataraxia? Is that the word?
Yes. Well, by the way, so to your point, the book is a melange of, my personal trajectory of happiness, coupled with ancient wisdoms, hence here come the ancient Greeks, and then coupled with backed up by contemporary science. And, it's amazing. And I'll talk about ataraxia in a second. Yeah. But I tell the story in the book of once having a chat with a fellow Lebanese author, Nassim Taleb, where he was kind of ribbing on me and saying, I don't know what you study in psychology and behavioral science, Gad, because everything that there is to know about human nature, the ancient Greeks already covered it. And so, I laughed, I chuckled along. And then many, many years later, as I was doing all my research for this book, and I did a deep dive into, the Stoics and Aristotle and Seneca and Epictetus and the rest of the gang, I said, I think Nassim Taleb might be right. Every time I came up with what brilliant insight, some guy had already said it 2,000 years ago. But to your point about ataraxia, it means tranquility of mind, right? And so I discuss it in the context, in one of the chapters, I talk about regret. How could you live? Part of living a good life is to be sitting on that proverbial porch when you're 85 with your spouse and having very few looming regrets. And so it's in that context that I introduced that beautiful term, ataraxia.
Yeah, we mentioned in the first segment, we put up some charts of suicide. So 50,000 people a year commit suicide. But the rate of suicide among those 75 and older is twice as high as 15 to 24. Now 15 to 18 is like pretty young, so that may bring their average down. But still, like 75 plus is the number one group that commits suicide. I wonder, so I don't know, just as a behavioral psychologist, like, do you have any thoughts on suicide? Have you studied this? Have you thought about this? And what do you think about the fact that 75-year-olds and older are the number one group doing it? You just mentioned regret, and that just popped in my head.
Right. No, I didn't know that specific. It surprised me that it's the 75 plus. But to your question, to your direct question, I actually published a paper, I think it was in 2007, in a medical journal where I looked at the relationship between suicides. So if you look at globally, the ratio of male to female suicides is 3-1, meaning 3 times more men commit suicide than women. Now, what I wanted to demonstrate in this paper is, are there ecological, cross-cultural variables that might make that ratio even more pronounced, 5-1, or less pronounced, 2-1? And my argument was, and I tested it, I did a statistical analysis where I demonstrated that to be true. I argued that whenever you have an environment that attacks men's social status, that accelerates their rate of suicide. In other words, men and women have different triggers for suicide. So men are much more likely to commit suicide if they have a devastating loss in social status. Women have other reasons why they might view suicide as a viable option. And so, to your point, I've actually published a paper in a medical journal on sex-specific issues relating to suicide.
Okay, interesting. I wonder is that why when I think older men committing suicide, I think maybe like the stereotypical thing in my mind, I don't know if it's true, it would be like epic loss of a job and therefore money and identity.
Well, yeah, Look, evolutionary psychology, which is my main area of research, basically argues that there are many things that you wouldn't expect men and women to exhibit any differences on, right? Both men and women are just as likely to love a juicy burger because from an evolutionary perspective, we both face the same challenges of caloric scarcity and caloric uncertainty. But on other issues, you expect to be clear sex differences in ways that would be predicted from evolutionary psychology. So regarding suicide, we expect that some triggers of suicide might be identical in men and women, but other triggers of suicide are going to be a lot more assorting on men or on women. And so back to the earlier point, when it comes to social status, to the extent that we know that around the world, when you ask men and women, what are the attributes that you are most likely to desire in an ideal mate, women are much more likely to state that a man's social status is important to them. Now, different cultures will measure social status differently. In one culture, it might be whether I have an Ivy League degree. In another culture, it might be how many cattle head I own. But there is no culture where women say, give me an apathetic, lazy guy who's in his boxers all day playing video games. That's sexy. I really want to mate with him. And so it's not surprising that when men have a devastating loss of social status, take, for example, the rogue investor who uses all the money, bets it, and loses it. Well, you better put that guy on suicide watch.
Yeah, no, that's right. Last question again, because I think our culture is way, way off on this. Does money lead to happiness?
It does up to a certain point, and then there's an inflection point. So, and I actually discussed this in the book. So, excuse me, the typical study has shown that up to about $75,000, we may need to adjust that now because of the devastating inflation. But the typical study has been that up to $75,000, more money is good because it allows me to get to my basic needs, right? I want to make sure that I have enough food for me and my family. I want to be able to pay the mortgage. But beyond that, in other words, Elon Musk is not infinitely happier than you, Mike, simply because he's worth $2 billion and you're worth less than 200 billion, right? And so up to a point, money is good. Beyond that point, it carries very little weight.
That's amazing truth. Also, that hamburger tastes just as juicy and delicious to me as it does Elon Musk. It's not 2
Indeed.
billion times more delicious, which is interesting
Indeed.
truth too. The Sad Truth. Go listen to Gad Saad, of course, and his newest book, The Sad Truth About Happiness, 8 Secrets for Leading the Good Life. And then while you're there, just pick up the other one about the parasitic mind. Gad, always good to talk to you, so thank you. Feel better.